Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Lloyd from Ulster University, from the School of the Built Environment, and specifically from the planning team within that school. Can I say at the outset, we're coming at this from a slightly different perspective, looking at planning and governance, but we would concur wholeheartedly with what Andrew has just said and what he's prescribed and advocated. I think that sort of recognition of the environmental sensitivity of the coast. And what I'm going to present is some thinking from our research, which is looking at the interconnectivity of both the land-based environment, the coast, and the sea, the marine, and looking at it in that wider context. This presentation, and thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation to come along, is being presented with Dr. Heather Ritchie, who's sitting in the audience. Dr. Heather Ritchie from the School of the Built Environment in the planning team, who's been doing a lot of work on marine thinking and marine policy, marine planning for some time, and Professor Deborah Peel, who was in the School of the Built Environment and who defected to the University of Dundee just about 18 months ago, but has kept up her links in terms of comparative research, particularly between Scotland and Northern Ireland. I would like to say as a plug, placement, what's it called, product placement or whatever, that in the school we have a growing interest in the planning and governance of the marine and the coast linked to land use planning. And we have Dr. Linda McElduff, who's joined the school, and I see a PhD student, David Stevenson, who's also working on it. So there's a lovely little group beginning to do it. I think they call them hubs now. I think that's the contemporary word. We're going to look at marine planning for the blue economy on a small island, big challenges. And essentially it's going to be talking to the challenges of dealing with the marine as a concept, the marine resource, the marine environment, but actually trying not to see it in terms of an isolated policy regime or a planning regime. It is actually, we're going to argue, linked inextricably with the coast and then with the land. And I think Andrew showed there the reciprocity between land and coast. Well, I think it goes the other way as well, and it then can create quite a significant challenge. Really, I'm going to stress two things. The aspirations for a blue economy. I mean, we've got green belts, we've got brown fields, you know, the blue economy just comes along, doesn't it, for the sea. But I think there are two dimensions to it. One, the marine itself, the marine environment itself, is highly complex, highly febrile, and a very, very vulnerable resource in its own right. It has diffuse property rights, it has contested claims on the resources that it offers, fishing, food, energy, and so on. And it's a very, very delicate ecosystem in its own right. Two concepts spring to mind when we think of the marine. One of them is that because of its property right regime, which tends to be based largely in common property rights, there tends to be over-exploitation, there tends to be over-competition for the marine resource. And this leads possibly to what's called the tragedy of the commons. In other words, we over-exploit. Think cod, think pollution, think congested freight lines and ferry routes and so on and so forth. We overdo it. So there's the possibility of the tragedy of the commons. And that in itself is actually a case, an intellectual case, a very strong case, for having some sort of marine planning. The second, and I'm borrowing here from the thinking of Mark Carney from the Bank of England, who in another context spoke recently about the tragedy of the horizons. I quite like that in the marine context, the horizon 22 miles away from us. But the tragedy of the horizons, and what he means by that, and it's perfectly applicable, is that actually to deal with something like the marine, we have to, no questions asked, take a long-term perspective. But we tend to respond in short-term periods. And what we do is that we forget about the long-term and we just think short-term. And what he's arguing is that with the economy, we should be thinking well ahead, as with the marine environment, in fact, the whole natural environment, we should be thinking on a much longer time period at all, indeed. George Monbiot, the environmental writer, actually says that we should be thinking automatically when it comes to natural ecosystems of a 100-year plan. Because that way you can actually look at the way that the environment can actually be moved and managed appropriately. So that's my first point. The marine is very contested. My second point is the links, the very important links between marine, coast and land. Why? Well, there are very strong tensions and contradictions in that threefold relationship. Because, for example, we're told we have an energy problem. And we're told that we've got to find new energy resources to provide stability in terms of prices and stability in terms of energy security. And we're told, of course, that the sea is where you can actually mine for oil and gas. However, if we don't want to breach the 2%, if you like, warning on climate change, we have to leave something like 90% of that resource intact. Now, when we come to talk about the seas, we're talking all the time about what is its potential for oil and gas. We're not linking those two sort of contradictions there. On the one hand, yes, there is a resource, thank you very much indeed, but two, we shouldn't actually be using it unless we want to really cause problems for society as a whole. Very, very quickly, and this probably gives the whole presentation away in a sense, what we're advocating based on our work is that there is a case for ecosystemic thinking. As Andrew has said, the environment sets very strong parameters, not only limits to what we can do, but actually limits to our intellectual understanding of how those ecosystems work. And I think understanding that is the evidence base for then responding to whatever problems and crises come. We're going to advocate using what we call a social ecological approach, which is really an integration. And what we're suggesting is that the land planning, the coastal zone management, and then the marine spatial planning regimes need to be brought together in a much more sort of fluid way. At the moment, however, we have great fragmentation. We have all sorts of different things coming through, from the Water Framework Directive through to Maritime Directive from the EU, and so on, and they're not joining properly. And we need to find ways that we can actually bring a much more coherent approach. And that's important, I think, in terms of Ireland and the island of Ireland, because we need to be able to think across the border in terms of bringing all these sorts of issues together. By ecosystemic thinking, we're going to draw on our terrestrial background, if you like, and draw on the work of Sir Patrick Geddes, who was one of the founding fathers of what we call town planning, or land-based planning. And he had this remarkable, well over 100 years ago now, a remarkable insight into how things connected. And at the time, and I believe even today, we tend to see things in very much silos or fragmented topics or issues, and we tend to deal with them in isolation from others. And Geddes created this notion of what he called the valley section, and he showed how the mountains came down in through the valleys, in through different types of species, forests, fields, pastures and so on, all the way down to rivers and the water and so on. And all his thinking recognized that if you started to tamper with any one element, there were consequences. And it would either go upstream or downstream, but there were consequences. Now, if he was talking about that 100 years ago, we haven't come much further forward when you think about it, and particularly when we're faced with these new ideas. In terms of the relationships that's involved, we actually try to make this distinction between the land side, the coastal, the yellowish, and if you like, going out to the marine. I was very touched actually by Andrew's presentation where he had the photograph of Porthcawl in South Wales. I grew up in Porthcawl, and that beach I remember surfing on in the 1960s and into the 70s. When it was a sandy beach, and I could show off in front of all the tourists because they were all on the seafront looking down as you... I know it's hard to believe, but times have moved on. Today, it's a tar macadam road, and the interesting thing that people don't talk about is you can lie on it, and if the sun's strong, the tar melts. So you get burnt in different ways. But it was quite interesting to see that, how we've actually interfered with what was once a most beautiful landscape. Now, it's actually then, how do we socially construct? How do we try and understand the relationship through these things that's important? And what we can actually do, and this is very simple, but it's actually quite effective, is to look at the pressures on land, coast, and marine. And what we find is that most of the demands are actually coming from the land, us. We're the ones who want to switch on the lights. We're the ones who want to eat. We're the ones who want to take our time at the beaches or in the seas and so on. And the marine is really where a lot of the supply comes from in terms of food, energy, and the potential, etc. And in between, there's then this coastal regime, which gets caught betwixt and between and comes under pressure from both sides, and itself can create problems then for either side. So the point is that what we'd like to be able to argue is that in understanding the blue economy and understanding marine spatial planning, we actually can't abstract from what's going on in the coast and what's going on the land. That's really our simple message. And we use this way of thinking, the socio-ecological resilience framework. And what's lovely here is that everything that Andrew put up in terms of armour, the hard approach to dealing with coastal erosion, for example, is based on an older way of thinking, and that was sort of engineering resilience. And lying behind engineering resilience was an understanding that you could return back to the original, the initial equilibrium. So a storm came in and caused all sorts of problems. You built these heavy-duty walls to try and get back and recreate what had been going on before. Whereas, that's now doesn't seem to work, and we know it doesn't work. The socio-ecological perspective says, well, look, we've got to be much more sensitive about this and recognize that these ecosystems are working through in very, very complex ways. There are different scales, there are different legislative frameworks, there are different organizations, and if they're fragmented and they don't connect, then we create a further layer of problems. And the other point is that running through all of that is actually different sets of property rights. On the land, property rights, private property rights, are usually very clearly defined. At the coast, you may have then new owners coming in like the National Trust, the Crown Estate, and so on. When you go out to sea, you're more into the realm of international political diplomacy. And for things like, if you look at the North Sea oil and gas fields, that's been carved up based on a metric around length of coastline between all the adjoining European countries. And they're straight lines. Now the sea isn't a straight line, it's moving, fish move, and so on. And so what we've got here are very difficult, I think, are very sensitive sets of property rights under that. And we've also got different interests coming in. In Scotland, about 10 years ago, there was a proposal to have a coastal national park up on the northwest coastline. And it was vetoed by the Scottish National Party when it came into power, simply because the fishing communities were against it and are a major supporter of the SNP. What's going on here? Well, if you like, there's a lobbying going on. There's politics here that are actually exercising their power. And then finally, there will be the relationships between these different things. As Andrew's pointed to, people don't like retreating. That's not in our behaviours. So it becomes very, very complex indeed how we kind of reconcile all these things. Using this threefold distinction, we can then begin to kind of try and understand the complexities that are going on here by looking at the different sort of processes that are taking place. On the land side, yes, we have flooding coming from the sea and over the coast and so on. We have major social and demographic change going on all the time. Relative economic performance. Dr. McElduff's work, for example, on the relative performance of different coastal communities and coastal resorts demonstrated how very, very different these places are. And work from in England by Professor Stephen Fothergill showed that actually a lot of the seaside towns are worse in terms of social exclusion than some of the inner cities. But they've been forgotten, they haven't been seen, they haven't been recognised. So what we have here, I think, are lots of new understandings that we need to kind of uncover, both on the land side, on the coast side, and then in terms of what do we mean by the economic potential of the blue economy. Because the ecosystems of the marine are both negative and positive. We can take from it food, but we also tend to dump waste. And finding that reconciliation is pretty important. The problem is, and as Andrew says, it's not the storms that are the problem, it's what people did. Well, it's with us. We have created, if you like, a set of regulations which have responded to land, to coast, and to sea separately. And they are maybe not integrated sufficiently. They're walking in close formation, but they're not connecting, they're not touching. And although there is some evidence that people are becoming much more receptive to these ideas, I don't think they're being achieved in practice at all. And that segmentation can be illustrated here. For the coast, we have what's called integrated coastal zone management, shoreline plans possibly. if we were lucky. You have marine plans for the marine, and then we have, and as we know, we're going through this at the moment with RPA, the new planning system being devolved down to local authorities. Huge challenges there. Now, here's the issue. It's not just that they're fragmented and they need to be integrated. It's a sense that, as a society, we tend to focus on the immediate. And I guess in Northern Ireland at the moment, the immediate is the new planning system under RPA, because that's the challenge. And then trying to integrate it with bigger systems becomes nearly overwhelming. So we need to rethink how we're dealing with all these particular issues. And one way of doing it, we're suggesting, is what we're calling a pooled sovereignty. And the pooled sovereignty is simply that we need to step back and to recognise that there are different scales at work, both from the international, there are international imperatives, right down to the local. BBC News today is calling attention to the loss of species diversity in the Irish Sea. You know, that's happening. There's the tragedy of the horizons. There's something that's really come forward very, very quickly. And really what we're suggesting is that we need to be able to link and be alert to the relationships between the land, the coast and the marine. It isn't enough to have land use planners talking about the need to build, let's say, sewerage systems, which actually don't take account of the sensitivity of the nearby coastline, which might be the conduit into the marine. And if those are rich fishing areas, we may get all sorts of conflicts coming on board. And that's before we begin to think about the potential for renewable energy and so on and so forth. What we're suggesting is we need to integrate both vertically through these different levels and horizontally. So we link how all these things connect. But we're also suggesting, and these are really drawn from bigger discussions around the planning world anyway, of course, we need to be engaging in democratic decision-making and openness and having active conversations about these matters. We need to be talking about them and recognising that there are limits to the environment that we need to take into account. And that will involve deliberate community engagement, which is the bête noire of the planning system anyway. And we need to be able to, if you like, bring pressure on our policymakers, on our politicians, to recognise the interconnectivities. We need to bring it all together into one package. Otherwise, we could be creating all sorts of unintended consequences. So the blue economy is there. The blue economy offers fantastic opportunities for society. It can certainly contribute to Northern Ireland's well-being. We certainly need to look at what Dublin is doing in terms of its marine planning, but also to start looking at how that connects with its coastal and land use planning arrangements. And Dublin at the moment is undergoing its own land use planning reform, let alone its marine planning. So this is a moving feast, and we need to be able to be, I think, very honest and brutal in talking about making those connections very, very quickly. Thank you very much indeed. You've been very patient.